Tonight, we will not step into the grand halls of banquets or the fiery speeches on the battlefield of the Virgin Queen. Instead, we will gently draw back the velvet curtain, following a faint, bittersweet scent that winds its way into Queen Elizabeth I's private chamber, a place where beauty was not bestowed by nature, but sculpted from layers of poison, and where each morning began with a silent ritual that slowly destroyed her body, piece by piece. You might imagine that a queen's room would be filled with the fragrance of roses and lavender, but here, the air is thick-heavy with the metallic tang of lead powder, the sharp bite of vinegar, and the faint, musty undertone that lingers behind the layers of perfume. It is the smell of power disguised as beauty. When the flickering candlelight casts its glow on a face so pale, it seems like porcelain. You might think her flawless. But trust me, if you knew what created that complexion, you might never look at one of her portraits the same way again. So, let's dim the lights. Let silence settle in and sink into the story. Tonight, we will peel back each layer of the mask until Queen Elizabeth I stands before you, and it will be an image entirely unlike the one you've always imagined. There are nights when the whole outside world falls into a gentle hush, that we finally have the patience to open the door of time and step into a story not just to hear, but to feel. Tonight, we will not walk through gilded halls, nor pause before the throne of royal audiences, nor lose ourselves in the lively music of court banquets. Instead, we will follow a long corridor draped in darkness, until we reach a half-closed door, the door leading into the private chamber of Queen Elizabeth I. You might think that the room of the most famous Queen of England would be filled with the scent of roses, sandalwood, or the faint trace of lavender from precious bottles of essential oils. But no, the air here is thick and heavy, as if you could cut it with a knife. There is a smell that is hard to name at first, the sharp sourness of vinegar, the metallic tang of metal, the faint sweetness of rose oil, and deep beneath it, a very slight mustiness, a scent you only notice if you stand still long enough. It is not the smell of life, but the smell of something being concealed. In the flickering candlelight, Elizabeth sits motionless before a large silver mirror. Her face is so white it seems to glow, not the rosy white of healthy skin, but a dull, opaque white like porcelain glaze, aged by time. From a distance, she looks like a living statue, meticulously carved so that every gaze must stop, admire, and keep its distance. But there is a truth the magnificent portraits hanging in the palace will never reveal to maintain that whiteness. Every morning, Elizabeth underwent a beauty ritual, a ritual in which layer upon layer of poison would seep into her blood. Day after day, month after month, year after year, a servant brings a silver tray, upon which rest small glass bottles, a porcelain bowl containing a thick greyish-white mixture, and several brushes as soft as rabbit fur. That mixture is called Venetian ceruse, the most luxurious cosmetic of its time, and also the most dangerous. It was made from finely ground lead powder, mixed with wine vinegar. When applied to the skin, it created a smooth white surface, covering all flaws from spots and freckles to the small scars left by smallpox. Elizabeth believed that flawless white skin was the symbol of power and purity. In an age when tanned skin was associated with labor in the fields, smooth, pale skin was a sign that one never had to work with one's hands. But to keep that purity, she had to pay with her own health. Each morning, the ladies-in-waiting began by dipping their brushes into the Venetian ceruse, then gently sweeping layer after layer onto the Queen's face and neck. The first sensation was coolness, but soon came a dry, tightening feeling, as if the skin were being bound in place. The first layer was not enough, they added a second, then a third, until the face became a flawless white plane, with no hint of the real skin beneath. Then came the rouge, not the pink blush of today, but cinnabar powder, a bright red mineral. In fact, mercury sulfide, no less toxic. They dabbed it lightly onto the cheeks, blending it to create a rosy contrast against the white base. The lips were also painted with finely ground cinnabar, mixed with a little beeswax to make the color last longer. You can imagine the smell of the room at that moment, the sour vinegar scent from the Venetian ceruse, the faint metallic taste of lead, the slight sweetness of beeswax, and the dried rose petals scattered to mask the chemical odors. But the attendants were so accustomed to this smell, they hardly noticed it anymore. Only someone entering for the first time would find it heavy and suffocating, like breathing in a freshly painted room coated with lead, overlaid with expensive perfume. The frightening part is, Elizabeth knew Venetian ceruse was toxic. She had heard stories of women losing their hair, their teeth loosening, their skin ulcerating after only a few years of use. But she continued, because for her, the power did not lie only in the sword or the law, but in how others saw her. A queen could not allow wrinkles, dark spots, or the marks of age to show, especially in a court full of those waiting for the smallest weakness to bring her down. And so, day after day, she let poison seep into her blood, as an inevitable part of the throne. If you close your eyes now, try to imagine the sound of the brush sweeping over skin, a faint sound, like silk paper brushing together. Imagine the trembling candlelight falling on the freshly applied white powder, making the face seem to glow. And imagine Elizabeth's eyes that never allowed weakness to show, looking straight at you through the silver mirror, as if to ask, "Are you ready to pay the price?" As I have. But it was from this very ritual that tragedy began to quietly take shape. The small sores around the corners of her mouth, the patches of skin peeling from her temples, the persistent headaches, all were only the beginning. Later, when illness came knocking, the powder would not only hide her age, but also conceal the slow decay happening while she was still alive. Tonight, before we go deeper into the story, let your mind remain in that room. Hear the sound of the silver spoon stirring the Venetian ceruse mixture, smell the vinegar, the lead, the dried rose petals mingling together, and feel something truly contradictory: beauty and poison, power and rot, splendor and ruin, all coexisting in every stroke brushed onto the Queen's face. Are you ready? Because from here, we will begin peeling away each layer of the mask, until only the bare truth remains about the hygiene and beauty habits of one of the most powerful figures in history. You might think that a queen with a lavish palace and dozens of attendants at her service must have lived in absolute cleanliness. But the truth was far from what you might imagine. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth I was famous for disliking baths. She once proudly declared that she bathed once a month, whether needed or not. And that was no joke. In the era Elizabeth lived, frequent bathing was often considered dangerous to health. It was believed that opening the pores too often would allow bad air and illness to enter the body. So instead of immersing herself in water, she chose dry bathing, using damp cloths, wine, and perfumes to cleanse herself. Imagine her morning. The ladies in waiting would bring a silver basin filled with warm water, infused with herbs and strong spirits. They would dip a cloth in, wring it gently, then wipe the Queen's body. The skin, rubbed with this scented water, would feel lightly cooled and pleasantly fragrant. But in reality, the dirt and sweat remained, merely masked by the perfume. Her clothing, especially the underdresses and chemises, absorbed sweat and body oils. But instead of being washed frequently, they were often just aired out, dusted with scented powder, and sprayed with perfume. Those layers of fabric gradually took on a mingled scent of stale sweat, perfume, and the metallic trace of lead powder from her neck and shoulders. Even her bright red hair, the emblem of Elizabeth, was rarely washed. She often wore wigs made from real hair, dyed copper or red, combined with her own tightly braided hair beneath. Her natural hair was dusted with scented powder and brushed often, but seldom touched by water. Over time, the mixture of powder, hair oils, and sweat formed a matted layer that took hours to untangle when a new wig was needed. You can imagine the scene of the ladies removing each braid, the powder falling like dust, revealing a scalp flushed red and speckled with rashes from the chemicals. The smell of the hair then was not of flowers, but the sharp, musty scent of powder mixed with body odor trapped for many days. Elizabeth's dental hygiene was also famously dreadful. She loved sweets, candied fruits, sugar pastries, almond confections, treats that only the nobility could indulge in so frequently. But at the time, there were no toothbrushes or toothpaste as we know them today. She used tooth powder made from crushed charcoal, salt, sometimes mixed with honey. This could clean temporarily, but it wore away the enamel. As she aged, her teeth began to fall out. Those that remained were black and decayed, her breath carrying a mix of cloying sweetness and foul odor, the familiar scent of tooth decay and gum infection. Foreign ambassadors recorded that when Elizabeth smiled, they could see dark gaps between her teeth. Of course, no one dared mention it to her face. And then, there was another secret, the distinctive scent that always lingered around Elizabeth. It was the smell of ambergris and musk, two rare perfumes, but used so heavily to mask other odors. When combined with the scent of lead, mercury, sweat, and hair oils, they created a kind of perfume of power that anyone who had ever entered her chamber could never forget. Also, because she bathed so infrequently, Elizabeth was very attentive to preserving her skin. She used all sorts of oils and creams to rub into her hands and feet, from almond oil, olive oil, to mixtures of animal fat and perfumes. But these creams collected dust quickly, leaving the skin beneath her gowns and gloves feeling sticky and slightly grey in tone. The servants said that on hot days, when the Queen stood for long periods in the hall, sweat would run beneath the many layers of her gowns. The air inside the dress became so hot and humid that steam would escape when she sat down, a strange blend of scents that made those nearby try to hold their breath. Yet, in the eyes of the court and her subjects, all of this was hidden behind layers of sumptuous velvet, glittering jewels, and costly perfume. For power, once wrapped in splendor, can make people forget the truth beneath. Tonight, as we sit here picturing Elizabeth, remember that every portrait of her was the product of a costume ritual lasting hours each day. From wigs dusted white, cheeks reddened with cinnabar, to porcelain smooth skin created by lead powder, all of it was a mask. A beautiful but poisonous mask. And perhaps the most frightening thing was not the poor hygiene or the toxic cosmetics, but the fact that Elizabeth accepted it all, as long as she could preserve an untouchable image. For in her world, to reign was to perform a role played every day, every hour, until the final breath. If there is one thing the magnificent portraits of Elizabeth I will never reveal, it is how she answered nature's call. For in the 16th century, the royal concept of a toilet was entirely different from what we know today. Her palace, though splendid, had no modern plumbing. There was no gleaming white porcelain bowl, no clean flush of water to carry everything away. Instead, in Elizabeth's private rooms stood what was called a close stool, a wooden or velvet-covered chair with a round hole in the seat, beneath which sat a pewter or copper basin to catch waste. On the outside, it looked like an elegant piece of furniture, sometimes even carved and draped in silk, so no one would guess it was a portable toilet. Elizabeth had an official position in her household called the groom of the stool, a close attendant responsible for preparing the chair, emptying the basin, and cleaning the Queen if needed. This was a strangely powerful role, performing a deeply private duty, yet having access to the Queen at her most intimate moments, often becoming someone she trusted politically. However, the daily work was far from romantic. They endured the smell, carefully carried the waste outside the palace, and washed the equipment with vinegar or scented herbs. Imagine a cold morning at Hampton Court. Elizabeth has just completed her heavy makeup, sipping a sweet wine. A servant brings in the red velvet-covered close stool, placing it near the fireplace, so she will not feel the chill. In their hand is a small perfume bottle, blended from lavender or rose to spray into the air and mask unpleasant odors. She sits down, the many layers of her gown carefully lifted by her ladies-in-waiting to avoid soiling the costly silk. The faint metallic sound of the pewter basin echoes as she shifts. You might think this is far too private for anyone to witness, but in that era, for royalty, even relieving oneself was a ritual orderly, assisted, and never entirely private. The problem was, cleaning was not always thorough. Although the basin was emptied daily, the smell lingered in the room, especially in summer. In addition, Tudor palaces often had garderobes, primitive toilets built into small towers, with holes dropping straight into the moat or a cesspit. But these places quickly became foul-smelling, as waste built up and was difficult to fully wash away. Elizabeth, ever mindful of her image and scent, did everything possible to disguise it. She often had dried herbs, such as rosemary, mint, and lavender scattered around the room, or carried pomanders, silver spheres filled with spices and ambergris in her sleeves to hold to her nose when needed. But this only suppressed the odor, not eliminated it. Records even state that she sometimes discussed matters of state while seated on the closed stool. This may sound strange, but it was not unusual among European nobility in the 16th and 17th centuries. Louis XIV of France later even received ambassadors while relieving himself, seeing it as a symbol of power that nothing, not even personal needs, could interrupt the affairs of state. As for toilet paper, the concept did not exist. Elizabeth used soft linen or cotton cloths, sometimes scented with perfume or herbs. These cloths were washed and reused, part of the duties of the palace laundry servants, at times, to create a feeling of purification. She would even use a small sponge, fixed to a wooden stick, dipped into warm herbal water before use. However, these very hygiene habits carried the risk of illness. Though Elizabeth was far more careful than many of her contemporaries, the repeated use of cloth and implements without proper sterilization could cause urinary tract infections or gynecological diseases, conditions that, in her time, were nearly impossible to cure. Some historians suspect that the severe stomach pains and prolonged fevers she suffered in middle age may have been linked to infections from her toilet habits. Interestingly, even when using the toilet, Elizabeth never abandoned her obsession with image. Servants said she always kept her back straight, chin slightly raised, and never allowed a grimace to cross her face. At times, she even continued conversing with close attendants, discussing politics or news from the battlefield, as if what was happening were nothing shameful at all. But when we piece together the whole picture, bathing rarely, painting her face with poison, wearing multiple layers of hard-to-wash clothing, and having a toilet chair in the corner of her chamber, the image of the Virgin Queen, pure and flawless, was in fact built upon a reality, rather heavy in scent. And perhaps this is the real point to ponder. Even the most powerful woman in England in the 16th century had to obey the limits of her body, eating, sleeping, relieving herself, things that no amount of velvet, gold, or authority could hide forever. If porcelain white skin was the first mask hiding Elizabeth's age and illness, then her fiery red hair was the second crown she wore each day. But like her skin, that red was not a lasting gift of nature, and the truth behind it was far less splendid. In her youth, Elizabeth had natural red hair, thick and lustrous, a heritage from her mother, Anne Boleyn, and perhaps from the distant Celtic blood in her lineage. But illness, age, and especially the layers of lead and cinnabar she wore daily, quietly drained the life from every strand. By middle age, her hair began to thin, then fall out in clumps. Each time she brushed, red hairs clung to the ivory comb, prompting her maids to gather and burn them immediately to prevent anyone from using them for spells. A genuine fear in that age of superstition. Elizabeth did not wash her hair often, not because she disliked cleanliness, but because in the 16th century, hair washing was thought to weaken the scalp and make one more vulnerable to illness. Instead of water, she and many nobles of her time used scented powders to absorb oil and odor. This powder was often made from wheat flour, rice powder, or powdered iris root, mixed with fragrances such as dried lavender, crushed rose petals, or ambergris. Every few days, her ladies would gently part her hair, sprinkle the powder, then use a wooden comb to work it through from roots to ends. The sound was like dry paper brushing together, while in the air, the powder and perfume rose into a thin, fragrant mist, or at least an attempt at fragrance. For beneath the powder, her scalp had already accumulated oil, sweat, and specks of powder fallen from her painted face. Imagine standing in that room as the wig was removed. Beneath lay her real hair, thinned, tangled, and matted into sections. With red patches or rashes caused by the powder and sweat buildup, the smell rising was a mix of dried flowers, ambergris, and a faint musty tang, the kind of odor only those who have not washed their hair for many weeks would know. To conceal this, Elizabeth almost always wore a wig in public. These wigs were made from other people's real hair, dyed bright red, and styled into elaborate curls or high coiffures. Some were even adorned with feathers, pearls, and gold leaf. Heavy enough to tire the neck after only a short time, they were stored on wooden stands, covered with linen cloths, and frequently dusted with scented powder to refresh them. When dressed in full regalia, the blazing red wig and snow-white skin formed the immortal image of the Virgin Queen, a symbol celebrated by court painters in countless portraits. But behind that image was an intricate operation of concealment. The ladies-in-waiting had to calculate the timing if an event was to take place in the evening. The wig would be secured with ribbons and silver pins, at least several hours beforehand. If the ceremony ran long, they would discreetly stand nearby to check, ensuring the hair had not shifted or that powder had not clumped on the forehead. Sometimes, from heat and sweat, a bit of powder mixed with skin oil would run down the temple, creating streaks of blotchy grey-white, but no one dared to mention it to the Queen. The wig was not merely decoration, it was also a psychological weapon. When negotiating with ambassadors or political rivals, Elizabeth often chose to wear high, voluminous curls that made her appear taller and more imposing. Candlelight reflected off the gleaming red strands, creating the illusion of a halo. Few would have guessed that beneath this crown of hair lay a fragile scalp that almost never touched water. In the final days of her life, as her health declined, Elizabeth removed her wigs, even less often, partly because she feared others seeing the truth, and partly because her scalp had grown weak and sore, making the constant removal and powdering uncomfortable. Once, an elderly lady-in-waiting recorded seeing a patch of the Queen's scalp peel away along with strands of real hair when the pins were removed, and Elizabeth merely pressed her lips together, said nothing, and signalled for another wig to be placed immediately. The irony was that, despite a lifetime spent preserving an unchanging image, Elizabeth could not stop the ravages of time. Those who witnessed her funeral recounted that when the wig was removed to place the burial shroud, what remained of her natural hair was sparse, streaked with grey, and clung tightly to her scalp. The smell of old powder, sweat, and dried hair dye mingled with the scent of a body beginning to decay. And perhaps that was the truth she feared most. No amount of powder, no wig, no power could keep her image alive as it appeared in paintings. All that remained was an old woman, nearly bald, sitting in a cold room, still trying to conceal herself even in the moments before crossing the final threshold. A morning in Elizabeth I's palace did not begin with the crowing of roosters or the chime of a clock, but with the quiet footsteps of attendants entering her private chamber. The morning light slipped through a narrow gap in the curtains, just enough to reveal faint ribbons of dust floating in the cold air, carrying traces of fragrance left from the night before. First, they brought in a wooden stand bearing 3 or 4 wigs, all of which had been dusted with scented powder the previous day, but would be refreshed this morning. A servant used a fine wooden comb to gently brush each curl, letting the excess powder fall onto a silver tray beneath. The sound of the powder falling was like light rain tapping on leaves. But in the air, a rich, sweet aroma immediately spread the mingled scents of rice powder, leona, and costly ambergris. Meanwhile, another lady in waiting prepared the Queen's real hair. Elizabeth sat on a velvet-covered chair, back straight, eyes gazing distantly into the large silver mirror. Her real hair, thin and streaked with grey, was divided into small sections and tightly braided against her scalp, forming a framework to secure the wig. If any strand was so weak that it broke during combing, the servant would quickly pick it up and place it into a small cloth pouch, both to keep the floor clean and to prevent anyone from taking the Queen's hair for witchcraft or political purposes. Once the real hair was secured, they chose the wig appropriate for the day's schedule. If it was a day to receive ambassadors, they selected a high, curled style edged with pearls, adding height and an aura of authority. If it was a day for horseback inspections, the wig would be neater, pinned securely with silver pins and ribbons, so it would not shift under her hat. Placing the wig on Elizabeth's head was a ritual in itself. The attendant had to lift it with both hands, to move slowly, then lower it gently so it fit perfectly over the braided framework beneath. Then came a series of silver pins inserted around the edge, one by one, to anchor it firmly so that no one could see where the real hair ended and the false began. Finally, a fine layer of scented powder was sprinkled over the entire wig, creating a soft, hazy effect when touched by candlelight or sunlight. But the hair was only the first step. Immediately after came the gowns, a process no less complex. Elizabeth wore many layers: a linen shift, an undergown, a corset, an outer skirt, a gown, and finally, the accessories. Each layer of fabric was heavy and close-fitting, especially the corset, which helped create a straight-backed posture and a small waist. When the corset laces were drawn tight, her breathing became slower and deeper, a posture both regal and constricting. At this moment, the ladies in waiting had to work in perfect coordination. One held the skirts, one fastened the hooks, another checked that the jewelry on the wig did not snag on the collar. The entire room was a sequence of silent movements, broken only by the rustle of fabric, the click of clasps, and the occasional quiet command from Elizabeth. When everything was complete, she looked into the mirror one last time. The blazing red hair, the smooth white skin, the flushed cheeks, the sumptuous velvet gown, all arranged to create the perfect image of the Virgin Queen, showing no trace of age or fatigue. Only the attendants who had taken part in the ritual knew beneath that radiance lay fragile real hair, a body bound tight, and an entire morning devoted to transforming herself into the very symbol of power. When the final layer of the gown was adjusted and the jewelry on the wig caught the candlelight, Elizabeth would touch the pearl necklace at her throat, confirming one last time that everything was in its proper place. But before leaving her chamber to appear before the court, there was another ritual, smaller, yet no less important. A ritual her closest attendants referred to in a hushed tone as the care of the Queen's smile. Today, when we think of oral hygiene, we picture toothbrushes, mint toothpaste, and refreshing mouthwash. But in the 16th century, even in a royal palace, the concept was entirely different. For Elizabeth, brushing her teeth was a manual ritual, using tools that were both refined and dangerous. She had a great fondness for sweets, thick fruit preserves, sugarusted pastries, honey-coated almond confections, all delicacies of the nobility. In things the common people rarely tasted. Banquets in the palace often featured an entire dessert table, laden with cakes and sugar-infused wines, and Elizabeth never hid her enjoyment of them. But this very habit was the reason her teeth deteriorated so quickly. Each morning, after her makeup was finished, she would sit in a chair by the window, where natural light allowed her attendants to see more clearly. On a small table sat a silver tray holding tooth powder, several clean lining cloths, and a small wooden stick wrapped with cloth at one end, what passed for a toothbrush in those days. Her tooth powder was a mixture of finely ground charcoal, sea salt, sometimes blended with honey or red wine. On some days, to create a pleasant taste, the attendants would add a little ground-dried herbs such as mint or basil. However, this mixture was both strongly abrasive and incapable of killing bacteria the way modern toothpaste can. It could make teeth appear temporarily whiter, but it wore away the enamel, exposing the dentin beneath. Elizabeth would dip the cloth-wrapped stick into the powder, then scrub each tooth. The sound that dry rasp of cloth against enamel was harsh and faintly unsettling, especially when combined with the sharp scent of salt and charcoal. Afterward, she would rinse her mouth with wine or warm herbal water to disinfect. A servant would hold a small bowl for her to spit into. Then she would rinse again until she felt her mouth was clean. But clean here was only a temporary sensation. The vast amounts of sugar in her diet, combined with the abrasion of charcoal and salt, steadily weakened her teeth. Diplomatic accounts from the 16th century note that by middle age, many of Elizabeth's teeth had turned a dark brown or black. Some were loose, and others had been lost entirely, leaving visible gaps when she smiled. A French ambassador once wrote of his meeting with her, the Queen. Though radiant in appearance, when she spoke, to reveal teeth that were darkened and uneven, yet her subjects seemed not to notice, or perhaps deliberately refrained from mentioning it. She was well aware of this condition, but instead of reducing the sweets she loved, Elizabeth found ways to conceal it. When speaking, she kept her lower lip slightly, covering her teeth, or smiled with her mouth closed. At important ceremonies, she sometimes painted her lips a deeper red to draw attention to them rather than to her teeth. Her attendants also tried to improve matters by adding powdered seashell or pumice stone to her tooth-cleaning mixture. These could polish the surface of the teeth, but also thinned the enamel, making her teeth more sensitive and prone to pain. Toothache became a constant companion for the Queen in her later years. When the pain peaked, she used strong wine as a mouth rinse to numb the gums, or chewed on a piece of dried clove, a common toothache remedy of the time. On some days, the pain was so severe she had to postpone an audience, sitting alone by the window with a warm herbal poultice pressed to her cheek. But the very next day, when appearing in public, she would don her wig, her velvet gown, and offer a measured smile as though nothing troubled her. Her fondness for sweets and the ineffective dental care methods gave her breath a distinctive scent, sweet yet faintly sour, a telltale sign of tooth decay and gum infection. To mask it, she always kept pastilles on hand, lozenges made of sugar, honey, and herbs. Ironically, These lozenges only fed the bacteria further, worsening the problem. In her final years, the loss of many teeth made eating difficult. Dishes had to be softened, cut into small pieces, or cooked down into thick porridge. She avoided tough meats or thick-crusted bread, instead eating soups, stews, and mashed fruits. But even when chewing was hard, she would not give up her beloved preserves and candies, sweets that had become almost inseparable from her image at the banquet table. One anecdote tells that once, the royal dentist advised her to have a badly decayed molar removed to avoid infection. Elizabeth, fearful of pain, asked the physician to try extracting a tooth from someone else first, so she could see. The volunteer was a trusted bishop. He agreed to prove the procedure was not so dreadful. But when Elizabeth saw the bloody extraction, she became even more terrified and refused, choosing instead to live with the pain for many more months. If we put all these details together, the picture becomes clear. A powerful queen, spending hours each morning perfecting her image from wig to makeup, to gown, to teeth. But beneath the radiance was a reality far less pleasant: blackened teeth, strong-smelling breath, unending toothache, all masked with fragrance, a restrained smile, and a mastery of directing the gaze of those around her. Tonight, when you close your eyes and picture Elizabeth I's smile, to remember that it was a smile, both beautiful and fragile, powerful and breakable. For like the white skin of lead powder or the blazing red wig, that smile was only part of the public face, kept not for health, but for the throne. If the red wig was her daily crown, Elizabeth I's gowns were the fortress that protected and displayed her power. But these were not the light, airy dresses meant for strolling in a garden. They were massive structures of fabric, iron frames, wooden hopes, and thousands of stitches heavy like armor. But instead of concealing, they flaunted grandeur. In the morning, after her hair and makeup were complete, the dressing ritual began. The attendants first dressed her in a smock, a long-sleeved linen undergarment, soft and clean, dried with herbs to give it a light fragrance. But that was only the first layer. Next came the corset made of canvas or leather, lined inside with whalebone to keep the back straight and cinch the waist. The laces were pulled tighter, notch by notch, until the queen's waist was reduced by several inches from its natural size. Elizabeth rarely objected to this tightening, for she knew that this artificial curve was part of her image of power. But the attendants often noticed her breathing becoming deeper and slower as soon as the corset was secured, a trained breath, so that no one outside the room would notice. Over the corset was the farthingale, a round skirt frame made of light wood or whalebone, covered in fabric, that spread the gown wide into a bell or oval shape. This gave Elizabeth a stately, imposing stance, but also turned every step into a delicate act of balance. The farthingale was so wide that when she passed through a narrow doorway, the attendants had to tilt it slightly to the side, and when she sat, she needed a chair without armrests, so the skirt's edge would not be obstructed. Next came the petticoat, a thick underskirt, often made of silk or velvet, both to give volume and to keep warm in England's damp winters. Only then came the outer gown, usually with a fitted bodice, high collar, long sleeves, and a skirt that fell to the floor. The materials were always of the finest quality velvet, embroidered with gold thread, Italian silk, or a Spanish brocade. Many gowns were adorned with pearls, beads, gilt thread, and even gemstones, so that each step reflected shimmering light. Overall, Elizabeth often wore a robe or long cloak edged with fur ermine or silver fox, which only royalty were permitted to wear under Tudor sumptuary laws. The cloak was both a symbol of status and the perfect backdrop to highlight the gold chains and medallions she wore across her chest. It took the attendants hours to complete the entire ensemble. They dressed her while adjusting every fold, pinning each point so the fabric would not shift. Afterward, a specialist in jewelry would attach flowers, pearls, or chains to the wig and collar. Everything had to harmonize in every detail. For Elizabeth believed her image was a message to both the court and foreign ambassadors. But this beauty came with inconvenience. Once dressed in all the layers, she could hardly bend down, lift objects, or walk quickly. Whenever she needed to move through a corridor, her retinue had to go ahead to open doors and clear the way. When she sat for long council sessions, the skirt's frame forced her to keep the same posture for hours, no matter if her back ached or her shoulders grew sore. In summer, the many layers trapped heat so intensely that the warmth rose within, mingling with perfume and the scent of her body, creating a private atmosphere around the Queen that only her attendants were accustomed to enduring. Still, Elizabeth never considered this a nuisance. On the contrary, she used that very inconvenience to create a barrier of power. No one could approach her too quickly. No one could touch her casually. And whenever she entered a room, the slow, majestic, splendid appearance like a living painting was enough to silence the entire space. Once, an Italian ambassador wrote in his journal, "The Queen does not enter a room like a person. She advances like a moving monument, wrapped in light and gold," making one forget that beneath all those layers is still a mortal body. But the attendants knew better. They knew that when night fell, it took nearly an hour to remove every gown, every pin, every lace, and when the final layer was let fall, Elizabeth would often sigh, take a few light steps, as if savoring the rare freedom before donning the fabric armor again the next morning. When the great bell rang to signal the end of the audience, Elizabeth left the council chamber. She walked slowly, the hem of her skirt brushing lightly over the stone floor, the pearls clinking together softly like falling rain. Outside, her attendants bowed, their eyes following her, until the door to her private chambers closed. Inside, there was no more noise from the palace, only the breath of a few candles, and the lingering scent of perfume on her gown. The attendants stepped forward and began the ritual of removing each layer of clothing, a ritual that took nearly an hour, but was the only moment in the day when Elizabeth gradually shed her monument. First came the fur-trimmed cloak, heavy and warm, lifted carefully from her shoulders and hung in the oak wardrobe. When the cloak was gone, her shoulders seemed to sink slightly, not from fatigue, but because her body had grown used to bearing that weight for so many hours. Next were the heavy pearl strands and medallions around her neck. The faint metallic sound of the clasps was barely audible, but in the quiet room it seemed sharp enough to mark each step away from her public image. Then the outer skirts were removed, each folded neatly. The farthingale, the vast skirt frame, was taken off last, freeing the space around her. Beneath, only the petticoat and the corset cinching her waist remained. It took the attendants several minutes to loosen the corset laces, notch by notch, until Elizabeth could take a deep breath for the first time that day. The sound of her exhale was as soft as wind slipping through a door crack, but enough for the eldest attendant nearby to know the Queen was weary. When the corset came away, deep red indentations ringed her waist and ribs. The skin beneath was smooth but cool to the touch, bearing the marks of a day spent tightly bound. Elizabeth's hand rested briefly on her hip, as if to remind herself that beneath all the velvet and brocade, she was still a woman of flesh and bone. Finally, the blazing red wig was removed. Candlelight glinted on the fine, graying strands of her real hair, slightly matted with scented powder and sweat. An attendant began to comb gently, careful not to hurt her already sensitive scalp. With each pass of the comb, a few strands came loose and fell silently onto the white cloth draped over her shoulders. In the mirror, Elizabeth was no longer the court's virgin queen. She was simply a woman at the end of the day, with thin hair, bare shoulders, and tired eyes after the makeup had partly worn away. Yet that gaze, stripped of all disguise, still held its unshaken pride. Perhaps it was the only thing in her day that needed no adjustment. When all was done, the attendants withdrew. Leaving the room in the soft glow of candlelight, Elizabeth wrapped herself in a light silk robe and sat by the half-open window, listening to the night wind rustle through the curtains. Outside, London lay in silence. Inside, the throne was left behind for the night. There was only her and a rare moment when her body was free. The Queen's private chamber sank into that gentle golden light that seemed to exist only on nights when the palace slept. Beyond, the footsteps of the guards faded away, the wide corridor echoing only with the faint clink of armor. As if afraid to disturb the rest of the ones seated within, Elizabeth had just been freed from a gown as heavy as a miniature castle. The layers of silk, brocade, lace, and gold thread embroidery had been lifted away, one by one, revealing a slender body still marked with red lines from the corset laces. The attendants closed the great door, leaving inside only the warm space of the fireplace, the faint scent of burning wood, and the soft crackle of glowing embers. She sat still for a long while, her shoulders sinking gently, as if she had just cast off an invisible burden. All day, her every gesture had to be precise. Every glance and smile measured just enough to maintain the image of the Virgin Queen in the eyes of her subjects and ambassadors across Europe. But now, with no watchful eyes upon her, she could exhale a long, true breath, letting her body slowly return to its natural rhythm. An elderly lady in waiting, loyal to her since youth, approached with a soft cloth soaked in warm water, infused with lavender. The cloth pressed lightly against the skin of her neck and shoulders, warm and gentle, as if sweeping away the tension that had clung to her from morning until night. A few fine hairs stuck to the nape of her neck were freed, falling onto the cloth like the last notes of a finished song. On the nearby oak table, a silver tray had been prepared, a jug of warm water, a small silver cup, a few slices of fresh lemon, a bottle of herbal wine, and an intricately carved wooden box containing tooth powder. This was the beginning of the evening ritual. Elizabeth called putting away the mask of lead and cinnabar she had worn all day to maintain her porcelain and proud beauty. She never fully washed the powder away. Instead, a small cloth soaked in wine or rosewater diluted vinegar was used to wipe around her eyes, lips, and any smudged areas. The sharp tang of vinegar mingled with the sweet scent of roses, creating a fragrance unique to her, suggesting cleanliness, yet tinged with the metallic hint of something quietly eroding her skin. The attendant wiped very gently, careful not to disturb the foundation still intact on her cheeks and forehead. She wanted only to touch it up the next morning, not start from scratch. It was this habit, leaving the lead on overnight, that caused her skin to grow thinner and drier, sometimes bleeding at the lightest touch. When the makeup had been adjusted just enough, Elizabeth sat before the large bronze mirror. Her real hair, once thick and lustrous, had thinned greatly after years of wigs, dyeing, and powder. The lady-in-waiting brought a wide-toothed wooden comb and slowly drew it from root to tip, detangling while gently massaging the scalp. The comb was dipped in almond oil mixed with rosemary to reduce breakage. Yet each time she finished, the fallen strands lay quietly on the tablecloth, like the last leaves of autumn. Candlelight glinted on the silver strands among the reddish brown, and Elizabeth did not turn away from them. She looked straight into her reflection, as if to commit to memory that time is the enemy no one escapes. When her hair was smooth, she placed her hands into a silver basin filled with warm water, rosemary leaves, and lemon. These were the same hands accustomed to signing decrees and deciding the fate of a nation. But now they were simply a woman's hands, trembling slightly from fatigue. After a few minutes of soaking, a soft towel was brought to dry them. Then a rich ointment of sheep's tallow and beeswax was rubbed in, bringing warmth and a protective thickness to the skin. Finally, she was led to her bed, a lavish structure with a carved wooden frame. Deep crimson velvet curtains, trimmed with gold thread, and a mattress stuffed with goose down soft as clouds. The curtains were drawn aside, and beneath her pillow, a small sachet of dried lavender had been placed to mask the scents of lead and powder, and to help her sleep. But even in this quiet space, Elizabeth's sleep was never truly at ease. She lay on her side, careful to keep her hair and the remaining powder undisturbed, a habit so ingrained that even with no one watching, she slept as if under the eyes of the entire court. On the small table beside the bed, a single candle burned inside a glass lantern, glowing steadily and safely, casting a soft golden light through the night. Elizabeth would often watch the flame for a few minutes, letting its blurred glow soften the thoughts in her mind. That golden flame was like the power she held, radiant yet fragile, always in need of protection from sudden winds. When the room had settled into stillness, she placed her hand over her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart. Though her mind was still occupied with diplomatic plans, court gossip, and news from distant voyages, she had once told her closest attendant, "A queen never truly sleeps. She only closes her eyes." And so, amid the velvet curtains and lavender scent, Elizabeth drifted into a light, unsettled sleep, where the line between dream and reality was as thin as the layer of white powder on her face, a sleep not wholly for rest, but to prepare for the next day, when the mask of power would be worn again, along with all the gazes of admiration and whispers of intrigue. The final years of the Tudor dynasty did not close with the sound of victory drums or the cheers of crowds outside the palace gates, but with a silence so heavy it was almost frightening. After more than 4 decades of rule, Elizabeth began to weaken. At first, it was only a slight ache in her legs. Mornings, waking to breathlessness in London's damp air, and the persistent cough that came with the long winters. But her strength faded faster than even she had imagined. She still tried to keep her daily rituals, still had her hair dressed, a touch of colour placed on her lips, and the heavy gowns of many stone put upon her to appear before the court. But her eyes had darkened, the shadows beneath them deepened, and the hands that had once signed so many decrees now trembled slightly when holding a pen. Each time she stood before the mirror, she saw her real hair thinner, the skin beneath the lead powder grey and dry, and deep inside, she knew that time had drawn near. There were nights she did not sleep, not because affairs of state kept her awake, but because of a vague fear, the fear that if she closed her eyes too long, she would never open them again. The Queen began refusing to lie in bed. Instead, she rested in a long chair, wrapped in a thick fur blanket, eyes wide open. Watching a half-burned candle, her attendants whispered that she feared, if she lay down, death would come at once. The court noticed the change. Audiences grew fewer. Private meetings about the succession were held more quietly, though rumours still slipped through the cold corridors of the palace. The question who will succeed her was heard at every feast and in every chamber. Elizabeth knew the answer well, but she avoided saying it outright. Perhaps she did not wish to face the truth that she, the last of the Tudors, was about to leave the throne forever. In her final days, she ate almost nothing. Her lips were dry and cracked, her voice hoarse. Servants brought her hot broth, but she would only sip and then shake her head. She grew so thin that her gowns had to be pinned at the waist to keep from slipping. Each step she took in her chamber was slow and heavy, the sound of silk trailing over stone, like the whisper of time itself. In March of the year 1603, it became clear that her illness could not be cured. Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, she said little, only asking that the curtains be drawn so she could look out at London's grey sky. Once, She smiled faintly at a ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds, but quickly turned away, as if unwilling to let anyone see such a moment of softness. It is said that, on one of her final nights, she quietly told a courtier, "I will not die in darkness. Keep the candle burning until I go." And they did, the trembling light casting its glow over her face, showing every worn line yet preserving the same pride. At dawn on the 24th of March, Elizabeth I breathed her last at Richmond Palace. There was no trumpet, no grand ceremony at once, only the quiet sobs of her attendants, and a hollow emptiness spreading through the corridors. News reached all of London, and the city sank into mourning. People wore black bands, lowered their flags, and whispered her name, as if unwilling to accept that the golden age of the Virgin Queen had ended. Her coffin was brought to Westminster in a funeral procession that lasted for hours, every street lined with white flowers and the continuous tolling of church bells. As she was laid to rest, a light rain began to fall, a thin but steady rain, as though even the sky grieved. And so, Elizabeth I, who had made herself into a living symbol, finally left this world, but her story of the heavy gowns, the lead powder, the sleepless nights, and the proud gaze that met death remains, like a figure both distant and vivid, forever lingering in the mist of history. The light rain that day had not yet ceased when the coffin of Queen Elizabeth I was lowered into the grave at Westminster Abbey. The church bells rang long and slow, each note echoing through the mist as if trying to hold everyone's steps a little longer. The people bowed their heads. The nobles stood in silence, and the courtiers, those who had followed her for decades, suppressed their sighs. When the coffin was closed, an era closed with it. Yet in that silence, everyone understood that what was being buried was not only a person, but an entire age she had built with her hands, her intellect, and her resolve. For to achieve 45 years of peaceful and prosperous reign, Elizabeth I had begun with an England exhausted by division, on the brink of civil war, and eyed by foreign powers, and with every step from her first days on the throne until her final strength faded, she skillfully turned disadvantages into advantages, shaped her own image into a unifying symbol, and led England into what later generations would call the Golden Age. So, where did that story begin? In November of the year 1558, London lay under a veil of mist. Every street and timbered rooftop shivered in the chill of early winter. News of Queen Mary I's death spread through the city, and with it, another name began to rise. Elizabeth, only 25 years old, but already destined to stand before the throne. On the day of her coronation, Westminster transformed into a vast stage. Flags fluttered, drums and trumpets sounded. Yet amidst all the noise, Elizabeth's steps were slow and steady. She knew well, she was inheriting not only a crown, but a fractured kingdom burdened with debt, torn by religious conflict, and with unsettled loyalty among the people. The first issue she faced was religion. Under Mary I, England leaned firmly toward Catholicism. But before that, under Henry VIII and Edward VI, it had turned toward the Reformation. Elizabeth did not want the country to keep falling into a bloody spiral over faith. So she introduced the Elizabethan settlement, a set of religious laws that preserved much of Catholic ceremony and appearance, while allowing doctrine and organization in the Protestant spirit. They said she was like a tightrope walker, skillfully balancing between two sides. The church still had altars, still kept candles, still wore ornate vestments, but the prayer book and Bible were printed in English, no longer fully bound to Rome. England, for the moment, fell quiet. No one completely won, but no one had to die for their belief. Then came politics. Elizabeth understood the crown could not stand firm if the treasury was empty. She tightened royal spending, cut reckless gifts to nobles, and made use of every lawful tax. Quietly, but effectively, public debt diminished, and the treasury began to fill again. She also chose carefully the men who would stand at her side. Her Privy Council under Elizabeth gathered loyal and capable figures such as William Cecil, both advisor and brake, when she grew too daring, and Francis Walsingham, the master of spies, who wove an intelligence network across Europe. Under their hands, the court ran smoothly, keeping secrets secure and controlling threats from abroad. But what etched Elizabeth into the memory of her people was not only reform or policy, but the way she appeared. Each time she came before the public, she was the embodiment of power and legend. Shimmering silk gowns, a high ruff like a halo, a face white as porcelain, red hair piled high and adorned with jewels. The people did not just see a queen, they saw a symbol. A woman without a husband, but with an entire kingdom. The English of the time called her the Virgin Queen, not only because she never married, but because they wanted to believe she belonged wholly to the realm. That image was cultivated with care through every ceremony, every portrait, every word. Once, before troops readying for battle, she declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England." That sentence is still repeated today as proof of her ability to turn weakness into strength and image into a weapon. In the early years of her reign, Elizabeth accomplished what many monarchs before her had failed to do. She made the people believe in the future. The streets of London grew less tense over religion. Merchants returned to the docks, and schools and printing houses bustled with activity. The throne still faced many storms, but the ship had begun to steady, and when night fell, in her private chamber, Elizabeth would remove her heavy garments and sit by candlelight. She knew she had completed another day without letting the country fall into chaos, and for a young queen facing so many broken legacies, that was a silent victory, more precious than any coronation ceremony. When Elizabeth I took the throne in the year 1558, England was not a shining jewel of Europe. It was more like a ship that had weathered a storm, its hull scarred, its sails in tatters, and its crew arguing endlessly about which direction to take. The national debt was overwhelming, the treasury nearly empty. Religion was torn in two, Catholic and Protestant, each side holding grudges against the other. Allies were scarce, and enemies stood just across the channel. Yet instead of hastily imposing harsh decrees or forcing anyone to choose sides, Elizabeth chose her own way, listening. It is said that in those first months, she spent much time speaking with both Catholic and Protestant clergy, hearing from wealthy merchants, as well as soldiers who had fought in battle. Her aim was not to persuade them to change their beliefs, but to understand what they feared and what could reassure them. From those fragments, she built the Elizabethan religious settlement, a set of laws flexible enough that no side felt crushed, but clear enough to maintain order. Church rituals kept a degree of Catholic solemnity, but the Bible and prayers were read in English so that ordinary people could understand. This fragile bridge stopped the river of blood from further religious persecution. But Elizabeth understood that spiritual peace would mean little if the treasury was empty. So she began tightening royal spending. Meaningless rewards for nobles were cut. Lavish banquets were scaled back. She also encouraged trade, urging English merchants to expand beyond Europe, laying the foundation for the transoceanic trade routes that would emerge later. Yet the strongest weapon Elizabeth possessed did not lie in statutes or in the treasury. It was in her own body and image. She knew she could not be an ordinary queen. She was a woman in a world of kings. So each time she appeared, she became a living symbol, gowns trimmed in gold, a high ruff like a halo, skin so white it seemed to glow in candlelight, red hair piled high and adorned with jewels. The image of the Virgin Queen was not merely to satisfy the public's imagination, but a political declaration she belonged to England, not to any man. In this way, Elizabeth avoided political marriages that could divide the country or place England under foreign influence. And then came the greatest challenge, the Spanish Armada. In the year 1588, Philip II of Spain, who had once proposed to Elizabeth but was rejected, decided to use naval power to subdue England. The Spanish fleet was considered the strongest in Europe at the time, while the English navy was much smaller, but Elizabeth did not panic. She went to Tilbury, stood before the soldiers, clad in silver armor and mounted on a white horse. Her voice rang out over the sea breeze. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England." That statement became the flame that ignited their determination. And then, with clever tactics, using wind and fire ships, the English navy shattered the Spanish Armada. The storms that followed wrecked the surviving enemy vessels. England not only escaped invasion, but asserted its power on the seas. From that moment, Elizabeth stepped into the Golden Age. Shakespeare's stage shone brightly in London, and the voyages of Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh expanded the known world. Trade, art, science all seemed to flourish at once. Yet amid all the splendor, Elizabeth kept the habit of working late, her eyes gazing far beyond the palace tower windows. Perhaps she understood that one day, her era too would close like all others. But until the final bell tolled, she had done what few dared to believe. She had transformed a small, divided England into a strong, united nation respected across Europe. After the victory over the Armada, the image of Elizabeth I was not only etched into the minds of the English people, but also echoed across Europe. No longer was she seen as the ruler of a small island trembling before the great continental powers. Now, England was a nation ready to set sail into the open seas. And in that moment, she seized the opportunity to usher in a brilliant cultural era, one that later generations would call Elizabethan as a golden hallmark. London at that time was like a heart beating at a rapid pace. Theatres sprang up, not only for the nobility but for commoners as well. Among them, the Globe Theatre became an icon, where the plays of William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe made audiences laugh and cry, shiver and marvel. Elizabeth not only patronized the arts, but also attended performances herself, sometimes offering comments on dialogue or costumes. She understood well that art was a soft weapon. It united the people, elevated the nation's image, and instilled in them a shared pride. But the patronage of the arts was only part of it. Elizabeth also skillfully opened the way for voyages of exploration, knowing full well that the risks of the sea could swallow ships and sailors alike. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, bringing back not only treasures but valuable information about new lands. Sir Walter Raleigh planted the English flag on the North American coast, laying the foundations for later colonies. Each successful journey became an adventure story told in taverns, inspiring young men to dream of setting sail for glory. Trade flourished as a result. Goods from Asia, Africa, and the New World poured into the docks of London. Pepper, cinnamon, silk, tobacco, sugar. The prosperous economy also gave Elizabeth more revenue to strengthen national defense, improve the navy, and maintain internal security. But notably, throughout this process, she never allowed herself to be drawn into a wasteful war of attrition. She chose skillful diplomacy, knowing when to be gentle, when to be firm, and most importantly, when to remain silent, so that the enemy would reveal their own weaknesses. Elizabeth also never forgot to tend to her personal image. Each public appearance was a perfect performance, from the color of her gown, to the style of her hair, to every piece of jewelry, all chosen to send a message. When she wanted to emphasize strength, she wore silver armor. When she needed softness, she chose a white brocade gown adorned with pearls, symbols of purity. And every official portrait was painted so that her face never changed with age, as if time itself had stopped before the Virgin Queen. Yet beneath that halo, Elizabeth was still a human being living in solitude, unmarried, childless. All her personal affections were restrained or sacrificed for the throne. It is said that on certain late nights, when the palace lay in silence, she would sit at her desk, her tired eyes fixed on the flickering candle, as if in conversation with herself. Even so, she never let that loneliness cloud her judgment. She lived and ruled as if she were an inseparable part of England itself. When her health declined, she still attended councils and signed the necessary decrees. Perhaps, deep down, she knew that every decision she made that day would echo for generations to come. And indeed, the legacy of Elizabeth I outlived the stone walls of the palace she once inhabited. She left behind a nation more united, wealthier, and more respected, a country that had found its voice and place amid a turbulent Europe. English culture in Elizabeth's time is still remembered as one of its brightest periods, not only because of Shakespeare or the great voyages, but because of the spirit of confidence, boldness, and independence she instilled in an entire people. Looking back over her reign, perhaps Elizabeth I never thought of herself as perfect, but she fulfilled the role of a keeper of the flame, ensuring that England's torch burned through the storms, and leaving it brighter than ever for the next generation. On the 24th of March in 1603, Elizabeth I drew her last breath at Richmond Palace, closing more than 44 years on the throne. When the news spread, all of England was filled with a sense of emptiness. No one in their lifetime had known another monarch. She was the embodiment of an entire era. Her funeral was conducted with solemnity, the procession stretching endlessly through the streets of London. People crowded to bid her farewell. Many wept, but their tears were not only of loss, they were also of gratitude. That day, England lost its queen, but what she left behind endured a strong nation, a flourishing culture, and a belief that even amid the roughest seas, if there is someone steadfast enough, the torch will keep burning. And so, the story of Elizabeth I, the woman who never allowed herself to be bound by anyone but her duty to the country, comes to a close. You might imagine that somewhere, in the night winds passing through the Tower of London, a gentle yet proud voice still whispers, "I am married to England, and England is married to me." Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, let the images of brocade gowns, condolis banquets, and the sound of the old sea fade away. Let the noise of the outside world retreat, leaving only the stillness of the room you are in. Sleep well, and perhaps, in tonight's dream, you will glimpse a figure in a white gown standing by the window, smiling toward the rising dawn.